Imagine lying awake, night after night, staring at the ceiling while your mind refuses to stop racing. You replay every mistake you've ever made, and then fast forward to every disaster you fear might happen tomorrow. That was Ethan's life at just 24 years old. His mind was a storm he couldn't escape. But then, he heard a rumor. A rumor about a mysterious professor living in the mountains, a man people whispered about, someone who held the secret to peace of mind. Ethan decided to find him, desperate for relief. And what he discovered wasn't a lecture or a miracle cure, but a challenge so simple it seemed almost ridiculous. Yet it changed his life forever. Let's find out what happened in today's story. Ethan Miller was only 24, but his mind felt like it had lived 100 restless years. Night after night, he would lie awake in his small Denver apartment, staring at the ceiling as the red glow of the alarm clock shifted from 1 to 2, and finally past 3 a.m. His body begged for sleep, yet his mind was a storm that refused to rest. Thoughts of the past, mistakes he couldn't undo, words he wished he'd never said, fought against worries of the future, unpaid bills, a career going nowhere, the possibility of being stuck in this endless cycle forever. Sometimes, Ethan would press his palms against his temples as if he could squeeze the noise out of his head. Other times, he would walk to the window and look down at the quiet Denver streets, wondering if anyone else felt the same silent war inside. His friends told him he thought too much. His coworkers said he worried too much. But nobody understood that Ethan couldn't simply turn it off. His mind had become his prison. Day, he wore a mask, smiling at work, nodding in conversations, but behind closed doors, the mask cracked. He was tired of pretending to be okay. What terrified him most was the possibility that this was permanent, that his life would always feel this way, heavy, restless, and joyless. One rainy morning, after yet another sleepless night, Ethan overheard a conversation at a coffee shop. Two older men were talking about a retired professor who lived in a small mountain town in the Rockies. His name was Dr. Henry Collins, once a respected psychology professor at the University of Chicago. Dr. Collins had left the city years ago and moved to the mountains. Locals whispered that people still visited him when nothing else worked, when therapy, medicine, and advice from friends weren't enough. The story lit a fragile spark of hope inside Ethan. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone who could help him find the peace he'd been searching for. He didn't expect miracles, but he was desperate for even a drop of relief. After finishing his coffee, Ethan pulled out his phone and typed map to Silver Ridge, Colorado into his GPS. It was a small mountain town tucked deep into the Rockies, about a 4-hour drive from Denver. He closed his eyes and whispered, "This is my last try." Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The following weekend, Ethan packed a small bag and set out on the journey. The road to Silver Ridge was long and winding, climbing higher into the mountains with each passing mile. Rain pattered on his windshield, and fog curled across the road like ghosts. More than once, Ethan considered turning back, but something inside pushed him forward, a quiet voice that said, "Keep going. You've tried everything else. What do you have to lose?" Hours later, exhausted but determined, he saw the wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Silver Ridge." The town was small, just a few shops, a diner, and homes tucked into the hillsides. but it felt untouched by the chaos of city life. At the far end of the town, nestled against the forest, stood a modest cabin. The front porch was lined with books, plants, and a rocking chair, where an elderly man sat, calmly reading as though the world around him didn't exist. His presence radiated something Ethan hadn't felt in years. Peace. Peace. With a mixture of nervousness and hope, Ethan stepped closer. His heart pounded as he whispered to himself, "Please, let this be the answer." Ethan sat in the corner of a coffee shop in downtown Denver, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug he hadn't touched. The chatter of strangers blurred into background noise, while his mind spun like a broken record. His phone buzzed on the table, emails from work, reminders about bills. A voicemail from his mother, but he ignored them all. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't pretending to be okay. He was simply tired. That was when he overheard the two men at the next table. Their voices cut through the fog in his mind. "I saw Henry Collins the other day," one of them said. He was in his 60s, wearing a baseball cap, stained with years of use. "Can you believe that man is still up there in Silver Ridge? He must be pushing 80. The other man chuckled. "Yeah, but he hasn't changed. Still sharp as ever." People say he's helped folks turn their lives around. Not with pills or fancy programs, just with the way he sees the world. Ethan's ears perked up. For reasons he couldn't explain, the name Henry Collins lodged itself in his mind. He turned slightly in his chair, pretending to read the newspaper on the table, but every nerve in his body focused on their conversation. The first man lowered his voice. "You know, back in Chicago, he was one of the top psychology professors, taught for decades, published books, could have had a lifetime of fame. But then, he just left, packed up and disappeared into the mountains." The second man nodded. "I heard he lost his wife, said the city was too loud, too crowded for grief. So he went to Silver Ridge. Folks up there say if you're desperate enough, you can knock on his door. He doesn't turn people away." The words "desperate enough" struck Ethan like a knife. That was him, desperate, more than desperate. He felt like a drowning man who had just glimpsed a lifeboat on the horizon. He stared into his untouched coffee, his heart racing. Was this a coincidence? Or was it something more? For months, he had been praying for relief, for some kind of answer. And now, here were two strangers, handing him a possibility he hadn't considered. That peace might not come from another prescription bottle, or from forcing himself into meditation apps he couldn't stick with. Maybe it could come from someone who truly understood. He pulled out his phone and typed the name Henry Collins into the search bar. Almost nothing came up. Just a few old academic articles, a faded faculty photo, and a brief obituary of his wife from years ago. No social media, no official website. It was as if the man had stepped out of the modern world entirely. But one result stood out, a small town newsletter with a headline that read, "Silver Ridge celebrates annual autumn festival." In the photo, children were playing in a park, while an elderly man with kind eyes watched from a wooden bench. The caption identified him, Dr. Henry Collins. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, something between hope and fear. He imagined knocking on the cabin door of this mysterious professor, only to be told to leave. Or worse, to be met with silence. Still, a voice inside whispered, "What if he really can help you? What if this is the sign you've been waiting for?" Ethan left the coffee shop in a daze, the rain outside soaking his hoodie as he hurried back to his car. He didn't even notice the cold. All he could think about was the name echoing in his head, Dr. Henry Collins. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at a folded map of Colorado. His finger traced the winding highway that led from Denver to Silver Ridge, a tiny dot pressed against the backdrop of the Rockies. The distance looked overwhelming. The weather forecast warned of rain and fog. Gas money was tight. His boss would notice if he didn't show up on Monday. Every logical reason told him to forget about it. But Ethan had learned something about himself in these restless years. Logic didn't stop the ache in his chest. Logic didn't quiet the noise in his head at 3 a.m. He needed something beyond logic, something deeper. Finally, just past midnight, he whispered into the silence of his apartment, "If I don't do this now, I never will." He stuffed a backpack with a change of clothes, a notebook, and the only book that ever gave him comfort, a battered copy of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Then he set his alarm for dawn. The journey to Silver Ridge would begin in a fee. The next morning, Ethan's alarm went off at 6 a.m., though he had hardly slept. His backpack was already waiting by the door, packed the night before in a rush of determination. As he zipped up his jacket and slung the bag over his shoulder, a wave of doubt hit him. What if this was foolish? What if Dr. Collins was nothing more than an old man with a reputation built on rumors? But the other voice, the quieter one, pushed him forward. What if he's exactly what you need? Ethan climbed into his aging Honda Civic, turned the key, and watched the dashboard flicker to life. The tank was half full. It would barely get him to Silver Ridge, but that was a problem for later. He pulled onto the highway as the Denver skyline shrank in the rearview mirror. At first, the drive was ordinary. Gray stretches of asphalt, billboards advertising lawyers and fast food, trucks roaring past. But as the miles ticked by, the scenery began to change. The flat sprawl of the city gave way to rolling foothills. Houses grew farther apart, replaced by long stretches of pine trees and rocky cliffs. The highway narrowed into a winding 2-lane road, climbing steadily upward into the mountains. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, drumming against the windshield. Fog rolled across the road in thick waves, forcing Ethan to grip the steering wheel tighter. He leaned forward, squinting at the yellow lines that seemed to vanish beneath the mist. His wipers squeaked rhythmically, a metronome for the anxious beating of his heart. He passed through small mountain towns, rows of shuttered shops, gas stations with a single pump, diners with neon signs that flickered against the gloom. In one town, he pulled over for gas, his hands trembling slightly as he swiped his card. The attendant, a middle-aged woman in a flannel shirt, gave him a curious look. "Rough weather for a drive," she said, her voice warm but wary. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you know a place called Silver Ridge?" Her eyebrows lifted. "Silver Ridge? That's another 40 minutes up the pass. Small place, not much there." Ethan nodded, thanked her, and got back into his car. But inside, his chest tightened with anticipation. 40 more minutes. I'm close. The road grew narrower, hugging the mountainside, with sharp drop-offs that disappeared into a sea of fog. Ethan's palms were slick against the steering wheel. A semi-truck appeared suddenly around a bend, horn blaring, forcing him to swerve closer to the guardrail. His heart slammed against his ribs as the truck thundered past. For a moment, he pulled over, his breath ragged, his hands shaking. "You could turn back now," the fearful voice whispered. "No one would blame you." But he pictured his sleepless nights, the endless loop of regrets and worries, the suffocating weight of his own thoughts. Then he remembered the name, Dr. Henry Collins. The thought steadied him. "I didn't come this far to quit," he whispered. He put the car back in gear and continued. As the elevation climbed, the rain eased, replaced by a soft drizzle that clung to the pine needles like tiny crystals. The fog began to thin, revealing glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. Ethan rolled down the window slightly, letting in the sharp, clean air of the mountains. For the first time in hours, he felt something stir inside him. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of it. Finally, just as his GPS announced he had arrived, the road curved into a valley, and there it was, a wooden sign weathered by years of snow and sun. "Welcome to Silver Ridge. Population 1,204. Elevation 7,500 feet." The town looked like something out of a painting. Wooden cabins lined the streets, smoke curling from chimneys. A small general store sat beside a diner with a flashing open sign. Children in rain boots splashed through puddles while their parents chatted on porches. Everything moved slower here, as if time itself had decided to rest. Ethan parked on Main Street and stepped out of the car. His legs felt heavy, his shoulders stiff from gripping the wheel. He looked around, searching. Then he saw it, a dirt path leading out of town, winding toward the forest. A local pointed him that way when he asked for Dr. Collins. The path was muddy, lined with towering pines whose branches dripped with rain. Birds darted between the trees, their wings flashing against the gray sky. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, crisp and grounding. Each step felt like he was walking deeper into another world, far from the noise and chaos of Denver. After 20 minutes of climbing, Ethan saw it. A modest wooden cabin nestled against the edge of the forest. The porch was cluttered with books stacked on small tables, potted plants spilling over their edges, and a rocking chair that swayed gently in the breeze. In it sat an elderly man with silver hair, glasses perched on his nose, a book resting in his lap. Dr. Henry Collins looked up as Ethan approached, his eyes calm, steady, almost as if he had been expecting him. For the first time in years, Ethan felt his restless mind go quiet, if only for a moment. Ethan hesitated at the edge of the porch, mud clinging to his shoes, his heart pounding harder than it had on the entire drive. The elderly man closed his book slowly and set it on a small wooden table beside him. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though time bowed to him instead of the other way around. "Come closer," the man said, his voice low but clear, like the sound of gravel underwater. Ethan swallowed. "Are you Dr. Collins?" The old man nodded, his gaze steady, piercing, yet kind. "And you must be someone who's lost his way." The words hit Ethan with a force he hadn't expected. He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Finally, he sighed. I can't shut my mind off. I overthink everything. My past, my future, it never stops. I feel like I'm drowning inside my own head." Dr. Collins studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the empty rocking chair across from him. "Sit." Ethan obeyed, the chair creaking under his weight. The porch was quiet except for the distant rustle of wind through the pines. and the faint drip of rain from the eaves. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't distracted by his phone or the city noise. It was just him, and this old man who seemed to see straight through him. "You want peace," Dr. Collins said at last. "But peace isn't something you find outside yourself. It's something you protect inside." Ethan frowned. "I've tried everything. Therapy, meditation apps, even medication. Nothing sticks. I can't keep my mind from racing." Dr. Collins leaned forward and picked up a small wooden cup from the table. It was filled to the brim with water, so full that the surface tension bulged slightly above the rim. He handed it carefully to Ethan. "Take this," he said. Ethan blinked. "It's a cup of water?" "Not just a cup of water," Dr. Collins replied. "I want you to walk around the town with this. Up the hill, past the general store, down by the diner, and back here. Do not spill a single drop." Ethan stared at him, half expecting a smile or a laugh that would reveal it as a joke. But the old man's face was serious. "You think this will help me?" Ethan asked. "I think," Dr. Collins said gently, "that you'll discover something for yourself, but only if you're willing." Reluctantly, Ethan stood, balancing the cup carefully in his hands. The water trembled at the rim, threatening to spill with even the slightest movement. "Focus," Dr. Collins said simply. Ethan stepped off the porch, his body tense. The muddy path felt uneven under his shoes, every pebble and root a potential disaster. His arms stiffened as he adjusted his grip on the cup, eyes locked on the fragile surface of the water. As he walked through the town, people glanced curiously at him. This young man tiptoeing past storefronts, with a cup of water held like a sacred treasure. He ignored their stares. He didn't dare look at the children playing with chalk on the sidewalk, or the couple laughing outside the diner. Every ounce of his attention clung to the cup. Halfway through the loop, a gust of wind swept down the street, rattling a sign and nearly knocking the cup from his hands. Ethan gasped, shielding it with his body, his breath shallow, his arms trembling. A few drops wavered, but clung to the rim. He steadied himself and kept going, sweat prickling at the back of his neck, despite the cool mountain air. By the time he returned to the cabin, his shoulders ached from the tension. His eyes burned from staring so hard at the water. But the cup was still full. Not a single drop had spilled. Exhausted, Ethan handed it back to Dr. Collins, his chest heaving. "There," he said, almost triumphant. "I did it." Dr. Collins accepted the cup with a small nod. Then, with that same calm voice, he asked, "Tell me, on your walk, did you notice the sound of the birds in the trees?" Ethan blinked. "No." "The colors of the wildflowers by the diner?" "No." "The children's laughter, the sunset breaking through the fog, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery?" Ethan hesitated, realizing the answer before he spoke. "No, sir. I didn't notice any of it. I only saw the water." Dr. Collins smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good. That's the lesson." Ethan frowned, confused. "The lesson?" "When your mind clings to one thing with complete focus, the noise of the world fades away," Dr. Collins explained. "You are not haunted by your past. You are not worried about your future. You are here, fully here. That cup was your present moment." Ethan stared down at his empty hands, the truth slowly sinking in. Ethan woke the next morning to the sound of birds outside the cabin window. His body was stiff from the long drive and the restless night on a creaky guest cot. But his mind was strangely clear. For the first time in weeks, he hadn't drowned in a sea of racing thoughts. Instead, one image replayed in his head: the cup of water. Dr. Collins greeted him on the porch, the mountain air crisp with the smell of pine and damp earth. The old man held the same wooden cup, freshly filled. "Today," he said, handing it over, "you'll try again, but this time, notice what you missed." Ethan frowned. "You mean look around while making sure I don't spill it?" Dr. Collins nodded. "Life doesn't stop while you guard your peace. The world still moves. The challenge is to remain present enough to notice beauty without letting your focus collapse." Ethan tightened his grip on the cup. His palms already felt clammy, but he nodded. "All right, I'll try." He started down the muddy trail into Silver Ridge once more, his steps slow and deliberate. The water shimmered at the rim, every ripple magnified in his eyes. At first, he walked just as before, rigid, staring only at the fragile surface. His thoughts narrowed to one obsession: don't spill, don't spill, don't spill. His shoulders ached from the tension. Then he remembered Colin's words, "Notice what you missed." He lifted his eyes slightly, just for a moment. The sound of children's laughter floated from the park, bright and free. He glanced up. Two kids chased each other around a swing set, boots splashing through puddles. A smile tugged at his lips, but the cup wobbled, forcing him back into focus. He steadied his breath. Step, balance, step. Further along, the smell of fresh bread drifted from the diner, warm and comforting. Ethan's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. Again, the cup wavered. Again, he caught it. The longer he walked, the more he realized how much he usually missed. A blue jay darted across his path, its feathers electric against the gray sky. A woman waved from her porch, a basket of apples at her feet. The clouds began to part, letting a streak of golden sunlight pierce through, illuminating the wet pavement like glass. But the water never left his sight for long. His gaze moved back and forth, cup, world, like a pendulum learning a new rhythm. When he finally reached the cabin again, his legs burned, his hands cramped, and sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool air. He placed the cup on the table before Collins with a sigh of relief. The old man peered at it. Not a drop spilled. Ethan collapsed into the rocking chair opposite him, exhaling heavily. That was harder than yesterday, but different. Collins leaned forward. "Tell me what you saw." Ethan hesitated, then listed them: the children, the bread, the blue jay, the sunlight. As he spoke, a realization bloomed inside him. Yesterday, the town had been invisible, drowned beneath his singular focus. Today, it had been alive. "And what about your thoughts?" Collins asked. Ethan frowned, searching himself. He expected the usual noise, the regrets, the what-ifs, the fears of tomorrow, but they hadn't been there. Not once during the walk had his mind spiraled into the storm. For those minutes, his attention had been divided only between the cup and the present moment. "They were gone," he said softly. "The thoughts, they just weren't there." Collins's eyes softened, his voice steady. "Because you gave your mind a task, you anchored it. Peace isn't about silence. It's about focus. Where your attention goes, your energy follows." Yesterday, you saw nothing but the cup. Today, You saw the world without losing the cup. That balance, that's living. Ethan sat in stunned silence. His entire life, he had been at war with his mind, trying to fight off thoughts like swatting at endless flies. And here, in 2 simple walks, this man had shown him another way, not by resisting, but by redirecting. He thought of all the nights he'd lain awake in Denver, trapped in regrets of yesterday and fears of tomorrow. If he had known how to hold on to a single cup of focus, his breath, his steps, the present moment, maybe he wouldn't have been so lost. A lump formed in his throat. He looked up at Collins. Is it really that simple? The old man chuckled softly. Simple. Yes, easy, not always. It takes practice. But peace is not a place you travel to. It's a flame you protect here. He tapped his chest. By choosing where your mind rests. Ethan's eyes stung with sudden tears. For the first time in years, he believed peace might be possible. Not as a distant dream, but as something he could carry with him. Drop by drop, moment by moment. He whispered almost to himself, I think I finally understand. The evening light spilled across the mountains as Ethan sat on the porch again, the cup now empty beside him. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but inside he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Something profound had shifted, yet he struggled to put it into words. Dr. Collins poured himself a cup of tea from a small kettle and leaned back in his chair. He studied Ethan quietly, letting the silence settle like dust in the cool mountain air. Finally, he spoke. You look troubled, even after success. Ethan rubbed his hands together. It doesn't make sense. Yesterday, I only focused on the cup. Today, I balanced the cup and the world. And for the first time, I wasn't drowning in thoughts. But I don't understand how it works. Why did my mind finally stop? Colin smiled faintly. Because you gave it something real to hold on to. Worry lives in 2 places, yesterday and tomorrow. Regret belongs to the past. Fear belongs to the future. But your cup, your task, existed only here in this moment. You anchored yourself in the present. Ethan frowned, thinking, so the cup was just a trick? A tool, Collins corrected gently. The cup, the water, even the walk, none of those matter on their own. What matters is where your mind was. Not in Denver, replaying mistakes. Not in tomorrow, fearing failure. It was here, in each step, each breath, each careful movement. That is presence. That is peace. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But what about real life? I can't walk around Denver every day balancing a cup of water. I've got bills, deadlines, problems that don't stop just because I want to focus on now. Collins nodded, as if expecting the question. Of course, life doesn't pause for us. But the practice is not about cups or mountains. It's about learning to choose your focus. Your cup can be anything. Your breath, your meal, the sound of rain, even a conversation with a friend. Whatever holds you in the moment, that is your anchor. He paused, taking a slow sip of tea. Most people live everywhere but here. They drag the weight of yesterday behind them and clutch tomorrow in their fists. They miss the only place life ever happens, the present. But when you learn to rest your mind in now, the noise fades. The storm quiets. You become free. The word struck Ethan like sunlight piercing clouds. He thought of the countless nights replaying old mistakes. What he should have said to his father. What he should have done differently in college. He thought of the mornings spent panicking over the future. Whether he'd lose his job, whether he'd ever feel happy again. None of it had changed anything. None of it had given him peace. But here, on this mountain porch, focusing on nothing more than a fragile cup of water, he had felt something he hadn't in years. Calm. He swallowed hard. So peace isn't something I have to chase. It's already inside me, if I learn to stay here. Collins's eyes softened, a flicker of approval passing through them. Exactly. Peace is not found in another city, another job, another relationship. It's not given by the past or guaranteed by the future. It is already within you. All you must do is protect it, guard it, like you guarded that water. Not perfectly, not forever, just one moment at a time. The old man leaned closer, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. Guard your inner flame, Ethan, because once you learn how, nothing, not regret, not fear, not even loss, can take it from you. Ethan's throat tightened. The words sank deep, touching something raw inside. He realized that for years, he had been searching outward. New routines, new solutions, new distractions, when the answer had been inward all along. His problem had never been the world. It had been his inability to live in it fully. A sudden breeze rustled the pines, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth. Ethan inhaled deeply, noticing every detail, the sharpness of the air, the fading warmth of the sun against his skin, the creak of the rocking chair beneath him. He felt alive in a way that startled him. Tears welled in his eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. For the first time, he wasn't trapped in yesterday or tomorrow. He was simply here. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Collins gave him a small, knowing smile. "Don't thank me. Thank the present moment. It's been waiting for you all along." They sat in silence after that, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. For Ethan, it wasn't just a sunset. It was proof that life, beautiful, fleeting, real, could only be touched in the now. The next morning, Ethan packed his small backpack and stood at the edge of Silver Ridge. The town was quiet, touched by the first golden light of day. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the dew sparkled on rooftops. It all felt different now, though nothing in the town had changed. The difference was in him. As he tightened the straps of his bag, Dr. Collins walked him to his car. The old man moved slowly, but with the calm certainty of someone who had long since stopped rushing against time. "You have everything you need," Collins said. His eyes were steady, his voice gentle, but firm. Ethan nodded. "I think I finally get it. Peace isn't out there waiting for me. It's already here. I just have to choose it." Collins placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, the storm in your mind won't disappear overnight. Some days the cup will spill. Some days you'll forget the present and drift into the past or the future. That's human. The practice is to notice and come back, again and again, like breathing." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'll try." "That's all you need," Collins replied. "The present moment is generous. It will always take you back." They shared a quiet nod before Ethan climbed into his car. The drive down the mountain felt nothing like the one that had brought him here. The road was still narrow, the cliffs still steep, the fog still curling across the highway. But instead of gripping the wheel with white knuckles, Ethan found himself breathing with the rhythm of the turns. He noticed the crisp air rushing through the crack in his window, the way sunlight scattered through the trees, the smell of wet pine. Every sensation felt sharper, alive, as if the world had been waiting for him to finally notice it. Halfway down, he pulled over at a scenic overlook. Below him stretched a valley, the Rockies towering in the distance. He stepped out, leaning against the guardrail, and let the silence of the mountains fill him. Normally, his mind would have darted into a dozen worries, emails waiting at work, his uncertain future, the regrets that always crept back. But this time, he didn't chase those thoughts. He simply breathed, watching the mist lift from the valley floor, watching the sun climb higher. It was enough. When Ethan returned to Denver that evening, the city was as noisy and restless as ever. Horns blaring, people rushing, neon lights flashing in the night. But inside, something had shifted. The storm was still there, but quieter, less commanding. He no longer felt like a prisoner inside his own mind. He carried with him the memory of the cup, the lesson of presence, and the voice of an old man reminding him that peace wasn't something to chase, it was something to guard. Over the next weeks, Ethan practiced. At work, when anxiety began to coil in his chest, he anchored himself to the sound of his own breath. At night, when old regrets tried to replay like broken records, he focused instead on the feeling of the bedsheets against his skin, the steady hum of the heater, the weight of the present moment pulling him back. Not every day was perfect. Sometimes he spilled the cup, snapping at a coworker, losing himself in what-if spirals, lying awake longer than he wanted. But now he knew how to return. The present was always waiting. And slowly, the restless young man began to change. One evening, weeks later, Ethan visited his parents. They were surprised to find him smiling, genuinely smiling, as he told them about his trip to Silver Ridge. His mother placed her hand on his and said, "I don't know what you found up there, but it looks good on you." Ethan simply replied, "I found now." For the viewers listening to his story, the lesson is simple yet profound. Most of us live like Ethan once did, haunted by what's gone, terrified of what hasn't come, never stopping long enough to experience what is. We chase peace as though it lives in a future achievement or a past mistake corrected. But peace cannot live in yesterday or tomorrow. It can only live here, in this moment, right now. Right now is where everything passes and everything comes back. Your soul is waiting within you, and your all smiles are gratitude saved as you continue to peace, love, and balance within yourself. In this moment. In this moment. In this moment. Like Ethan's cup of water, our focus is fragile. Distractions, fears, regrets. They are the gusts of wind and uneven ground threatening to spill it. But if we learn to guard it, if we learn to anchor ourselves in the present, then even in chaos, we can find calm. The world won't slow down. Problems won't vanish. But within us is the ability to hold steady, to notice the laughter of children, the warmth of sunlight, the smell of fresh bread, and the quiet rhythm of our own breathing. Peace is not something to seek. It is something to remember, something to protect. And once you learn to guard your inner flame, no storm can extinguish it. If Ethan's journey resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Click the like button to let us know this story meant something to you. Share it with a friend who might be caught in their own storm of thoughts. They may need this reminder more than you realize. And we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where being fully present changed everything for you? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's video will take you on another powerful journey that just might shift your perspective in ways you never expected. Until then, protect your inner flame. Stay present, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next story.